In this video, I am gonna tell you about the media and the violence. It is a truth often proposed that the media contains too much violence and that this violence is in some way to blame for violence social behaviors. But what has been proposed has not been demonstrated. This is not to say that there is no relationship between media depictions of violence and social behaviors and attitudes, but say that the nature of relationship is complex, and this is certainly has been demonstrated that the media directly cause violence. The problem with talking about media effects and violence does not just start with embedded social assumptions about the media doing things to people. There are other problems too with The problem with talking about media effects and media violence does not just start with embedded social assumptions about media doing things to people. This does not mean that we should be unconcerned about representations of violent act and attitudes. Neither does it mean that one investigation of relationship between media and society, between text and audience, but it does mean that generalization are not acceptable. One should also reflect on models for media and society. Media violence is often discussed in relationships to act harm done to the body, depicted on television, on films, and the context of confliction material. It is more complicated and problematic than this. Again, violence is not just physical. People inflict psychological and emotional damage on others. Their emotional charge and possible effects on the audience are different from but not demonstrably less than. If the nature of violence is variable, so are its context, causes, and effects. Another variable which helps define violence in our minds is the medium. There is an assumption made about the emotional impact of graphic representations. Violence is not a single act of a single text within a single medium. Violence, whatever it is exactly, it is a composite of experience across media. And media is not only have characters that help define the nature and significance of violence. Violence is different when seen from a subjective rather than an objective view. Violence seems different according to its consequences. Violence is something that is perceived and judged through its representations. We need to remind ourselves of essential truth about the nature of representation. Violence in the media is only a constructed version of what it pretends to represent. It is not real violence, but as a representation. We know that a film about organized crime is an artificial and that watching it as an experience separate from everyday living in which, for most of us, organized crime does not figure. Even just to talk about children is an audience is to invoke a discourse of childhood set of ideas. It is true that many people may only experience violent death through the media. But again, violent talk and some violent behavior is a part of social experience, starting for instance, with bullying at school. It is uncritical to discuss the effect of media violence as if it is a unique source of such experience. People in the industry believe that violence is an essential tool in building audience, especially younger audience. Emotional and critical development varies between individuals.
Continuous exposure to violence in any media form, whether it be video games, television, film, does create and aggressive thoughts.
We are now talking about audience profile by age, yet another definition and another minefield. We are simply not clear as to the effect of various kinds of violent material on these various kinds of children. Indeed, it would be by definition impossible to reach children's response to violent material. We do know that children are disturbed by exposure of kinds of first-hand violence, by experience of war, social aggression and killing. One also has to take account on the real partners of children's viewing, which depends on the age of the young person involved. A drama involving raw death will affect someone who has experienced the first hand differently from others. One of the most obvious example here is the cartoon aimed by children, extremely violence may be a feature of this material. For instance, Tom and Jerry. Every approach to research does have its problem, which work against drawing absolute conclusion about media influence and violence. This depends on assumptions about how one defined violence in a given medium, how one categorized types of violence, and then on how one measures violence incidents by number, for example, or by the time space given to them. One might read violent novels all day and every day without disproving anything about how the material is made sense of or it affects the readers. A high proportion of violence is committed by good characters. Much of the violence is portrayed in humorous context. Rates are higher for verbal violence than the physical violence. Rate of violence fluctuate across different types of programs. Violent crime is much more frequent on TV than in real life. Most perpetrators are white, middle-aged, and male. Consequences for victims are rarely shown. Weapons are often found in violent acts. These are inherently unreal because they take place under artificially controlled conditions. They remove the influence of everyday surrounding and influence the context of life. These are only as effective and significant as the quality of the questions and the reliability of the respondents, let alone the validity of what sense of research makes of a given set of responses. One problem, among others, was the work dependent on the recall of respondents. Affect models are inherently problematic because they are hypothetical. These models are about short-term cause and effects and include so-called copycat killings. However, they may be a response to some media behaviors. Apart from the fact that this model has been little used to evaluate violent material and violent behaviors, persuasive as it is predicted on the fact that such needs actually exist. It would seem that a general problem with the research into media and violence is selectivity of approach and a failure to take whole views of problem, methodologies, and the range of work in the field. One may also notice various indirect effects of regulation on the presence and consumptions of violent material. Violence experienced over a period of time encourages a climate of acceptance toward and even approval of some kinds of violent act. As we know that violence excites the readers. The use of media does not occur in a vacuum, but it is true that people are frightened by the experience of violence through the media.